Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you had a good lunch and we can keep you awake. My name is Colleen Sharp. I'm with Spatial Focus. I see a lot of familiar faces in the room, and so those of you that don't know me, I used to work for the city of Raleigh for almost 30 years, and so I helped get this master address repository project started when I was still a full-time employee. Also with us on the panel, and is going to help with the presentation, is Robert Appleby, who's with RGA Associates. We have Diane Saunders, who is the address coordinator at Wake County GIS, and we have Kristen Young, who is, I have to read her title because it's pretty long. She is the Enterprise Senior GIS Administrator at the City of Raleigh Enterprise GIS Group. And we are going to talk to you a little bit. Uh-oh, what's that? Oh, wait. Hold on. There's something that popped up in front of me, and it's not on your screen, and I don't have my glasses on. Thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about this master address repository project that we're working on at Wake County. And, excuse me, I'm going to give a brief overview and talk about different things that you all already may know about, but just trying to lay the foundation, and we're going to start with the big picture and move down to how we've actually implemented in Raleigh and Wake County. So we're going to talk a little bit about addresses in general, which most people think they know what an address is, and then I talk to people out in the real world, and you find out that they don't, everybody thinks their address is what their house address is, and they don't really understand anything else about it. So those of us that work in government know that addresses are central to everything. They're in all of our databases. They're in all of our business practices. So an address specifically is a secret. Not a secret. Maybe I should put my glasses on. A street address, maybe it should be secret. A street address specifies a location by reference to a thoroughfare or to a landmark, or it specifies a point of postal delivery. That's a definition that comes from an FGDC standard, which we'll talk about in just a couple minutes. There are basically 4 types of addresses: thoroughfare, landmark, postal, and general. In the interest of time, I'm going to breeze through a lot of this for everybody, so we can get to the good stuff. Address elements. Every address has different elements, and most of us know them. There's the numbers, there's the street names, there's sub-addresses, which are also units and suites, rooms, those kinds of things. There's landmark names. Is it the Washington Monument? Is it the White House? A landmark has a name. Then it also includes larger areas like the state or the city or the county that an address may be in. So all of those things put together create an address. Then you also have your address elements, address attributes. And attributes are, the purpose of that is for documentation or to help you do quality control or for mapping. And that includes the address ID, it includes the coordinates, it includes what type of address is it, the feature type, is it, what's the parity, the sequence, those things would be used for quality control. So all of those things get built together, and in a minimum for an address to exist per the standards, for a thoroughfare, you have to have a street name, a place, and a state. And for a landmark, you have to have the landmark name, a place, and a state. And in both cases, you have to have an ID, because if you don't have a unique ID, you are kind of sunk when it comes to this stuff. An address reference system, I didn't even know that there had a name for this until a few years ago, but per the standard, there is an address reference system, and that describes the business rules used to assign addresses. Those of us that do addressing, we all have rules that we use, and part of the address reference system is documenting those rules so that everybody is working under the same business conditions and your addresses have consistency. So there are 3 major types in the United States. There is an axial or grid system, which has a starting point, and all the addresses radiate out from that starting point, wherever that center grid point. In the city of Raleigh, it's the state capital, and all addresses move out from there. In Forsyth, Winston-Salem, I believe it's right downtown. I can't remember what the street is, but there's a grid, and it goes out from there. There's also the linear non-axial type, which is where the numbering's based on the distance along a center line. Every 26 feet, you might have an address point. That is common in some other areas. A lot in North Carolina, it's a combination of both axial and non-linear axial. And then there's area-based, so an addresses are assigned a certain way within a specific area, like a mobile home park or something like that, where they may be using lot numbers to do their addressing. And so then the address reference system components, I'll go into this documentation. It's really, when you think about it, it becomes your manual of how you do addressing. It includes the name. And so an address reference system per the standard, the name is the area, and it may or may not be match the local government, but it typically does if the extent of where your authority is to do addressing. The authority is who has the authority to assign or change addresses within that area. So if your extent is your ETJ in North Carolina, you have all the way out to your ETJ and you can do addressing there, then it may be named the city of Raleigh or the city of Winston-Salem or wherever. That address would be the name of your ARS, and it covers the extent where do you have authority, and it includes the type. But the most important part about an address reference system is the business rules, which define how you assign your addresses. And so how do you do your numbering? Is it by intervals of 2 or 4? Townhouses are by 2, single family are by 4. Is it all along the street, as I said, every 26 feet? What are your rules for your street names? Can you have duplicates? How many characters can be in your street name? How about your types? Do you have a list of domains? What are the values that you're allowed to have? The Postal Service has a list of street types that is, I think, a mile long. But in your jurisdiction, do you allow people to use any street type that's on the list? In the city of Raleigh, for example, they do not. They've narrowed down the list that shows up in the postal standard, and they say these are the only ones that we want in our community. So your rules, when can a street be named after a person? You know, your rule might be they have to be dead for 5 years, they have to have been significant to your community, but all of those things are part of the address reference system, and they are the rules for how you are going to do addressing in your community. And it's real important to get that documented, because if someone leaves and you have the next person come in, you want to have addresses be consistently assigned and managed throughout your entire jurisdiction over time. For example, in the city of Raleigh, they weren't that way for a while, and there are areas in the city that we can look at and say, oh, okay, that was when so-and-so was doing addressing, because they did it a certain way, and then the rules started to get documented more as we got into the 90s and got a little more specific. But there are certain areas we can say, oh, we know who did that address. Next, so we have addresses, and we have all of our rules about how we're going to assign and change and manage addresses, and now we want to use addresses as data. Well, there are address standards. There are several existing standards out there. There is I have to read this because I never get it right. The FGDC standard, a thoroughfare standard, is the United States Thoroughfare Landmark and Postal Address Data Standard. And it includes the standards for how to address anything. Whether it is a utility structure, it talks about a thoroughfare is typically, we all think of a thoroughfare as a street, but a thoroughfare could be a river, a thoroughfare could be a walkway, all of those things, and there's rules and standards on how you build your addresses, and they're included within the standard. There's also the UPS, the United States Postal Service addressing standard, and there is the NINA standard. The FGDC standard and what we are doing and building is an FGDC compliant master address repository. And it includes, it's a data content standard. It doesn't have the schema for how your database needs to be designed, but it does have the pieces of data that need to be in your in your database for how to manage your addresses. And part of this is for data exchange and being able to share data across organizations. So it defines your address data elements, which include your number and your street names. And all of these are parsed and broken out much more than they used to be. You know, a lot of us are used to a 4-part parse. In the FGDC standard, there are 7 pieces. There's an address number prefix and an address number suffix. And then within the street name, you have the directional directional prefix and the directional suffix and the street type, and there can be a pre-type and a post-type. So there's a lot of ways to break out the address that can be used across the entire United States, and everybody can share data and put it in the right columns and in the right way. And then you have address attributes, which we talked about a little bit before, but it tells you what each attribute and what the standard defines it. So if you have any question, as we were building the address repository, there were times where we were like, well, what is this feature type? What does this mean? And we'd have to go to the standard, we'd have to read what it says, the definition is, and say, okay, that means we need to store this piece of information in this particular column. And we're trying to be consistent with our naming and how we want to do things. So it's like, where do we store things in the database? And that's what the standard helps do. And it also has all the address reference system elements we talked about, the name and those kinds of things. It also has a lot of data quality pieces in it, which help. There's actually SQL code. I mean, those of you that are interested in it, there are pages and pages and pages of SQL code that have routines for how you can quality control your address data. Checking for parity, checking for sequencing. So all of that helps you build a database that is easier to use and easier to maintain. And so then you have your addresses, you have your address reference system, you figured out how you want to have your data, and so now we're going to build a master address repository. And a master address repository is both tabular and spatial. In our case, we're using an Oracle backend. Well, actually, we use Oracle for everything, but we have our SDE for our spatial components, and we have Oracle backend tabular database that brings them all together. When you build an address repository, typically you get as much information as you can from as many sources. As I said to begin with, we have addresses in every database. So you go and you get the data that you want. You get it from the Board of Elections. You get it from the utility billing people. You bring all that data together, you standardize it. So you might have 3 examples of 123 Blue Street, and you might have one that says 123 Blue Lane. Well, is Blue Lane just an anomaly in that particular data set, or is it really supposed to be 123 Blue Street? So, you know, every database has a little bit different, and so part of this whole building the repository is you bring all the data together, you standardize it, and you put it into the FGDC format, and then you are set up to do interfaces. And that, to me, is actually the biggest advantage of doing a master address repository. You have one central source of addresses, in our case, for all of Wake County. And any application uses that to validate addresses, to store addresses. So in our utility billing system, for example, they have proprietary software that has to have the address be stored there, but we are also storing the address ID in the utility billing system. So if we change the address or we change the street name in the master address repository, all we have to do is push it out to the IDs that are affected, and it automatically updates those other business systems. We have web services that allow you to validate addresses, so some of the business systems can check, is this a valid address for me to issue a permit? Is it in Raleigh? Is it in Cary? Is it in Wake Forest? And then views. Views are the most, no, not the most, but they are a very powerful part of an address repository. So you can take your data that's all parsed out and all put in that FGD standard. It allows you to have multiple sets of abbreviations, those kinds of things. So if your CAD system needs a 2-character field type like AV for avenue, you can have that character and those domains in there, and then you can have a 3-character domain, the AVE, for another application. You create a view that puts the data together that matches the needs of that particular business system. So you could have multiple views. You could have a view for your utility billing system, you could have a view for your permitting system, you could have a view for your CAD system. All 3 could be different. All of the data is stored in the same database, but it's all coming from one database and being put out to all of your applications. And then the most important part really is your ongoing maintenance of a master address repository. It takes a lot of effort to build it, and you pull in all of this data and you get it good. Well, now how am I going to take care of it? How am I going to, maintain it on an ongoing day-to-day basis? And that's where Robert's going to talk. And he's going to tell us a little bit about maintaining a repository. Did I talk in less than 10 minutes?
Oh boy. So we got two phases here, or two things that I'm going to talk about here. Is one, the database and the tools itself. I'm not going to get into the weeds on the database. The other thing is they gave me the enviable task of MAR versus the local government model. And I'll kind of step through each one of those, and let's just go ahead and get started. Wrong way. So the way I do tools and stuff like that is there's usually going to be two different types of tools. There's going to be database tools, and then there's going to be actual GUI interface types of tools. When it comes to addressing and segments and stuff like that, again, I even break that out into two categories themselves. You're going to deal with address points, and you're going to deal with polylines themselves for your street segments. The key to all of that is keeping those two in sync and forming that relationship between that address. So what I'm showing here now is these are some pretty easy queries that you can set up in the database that can help you in defining these and making sure that your data is being kept in a quality state. Definitely going to want to generate unique IDs. What I have gotten out of vendors for NG911 and Public Works and different departments over the Southeast United States anyway is that you can't always use a number. Some of these applications actually are old school and they require text strings for things. So in most cases, it's not a bad idea to generate a GUID and then also generate a unique identifier. From the view standpoint, you're going to want to make sure that you have ranges on every segment that you have out there. If you don't know what they are, start them out with 0 zeros and just work your way through it. You're going to want to verify that association between the addresses and the segments themselves. The other thing you have to support is aliases. I'm quite sure we got Highway 120, but it's also called Dugtown Mountain Road, or it's got other aliases. You're going to want to be able to track those as well. And essentially also the history. And you noticed I've got history down there for both addresses and segments. It's critical. So that's pretty much, and you'll see you want to make sure that you're doing consistent attribution across your database. It's not, like Colleen had said, it's not just a number. I didn't know all of this 10 years ago myself, but it's not just a number. Same thing, you're going to want to know your types of addresses out there because water may have a way of billing, and they're going to want to have every meter have an address. Yes, you would hope that it associates to the homeowner's address, not necessarily true in every case. You also want to be able to identify anomalies, and anomalies where an address is not within a range or it's on the wrong side of the street, and that's where your parodies come in. Next, you're going to want to take a look at GIS tools. And I want you to keep in mind when I say GIS, I'm not talking just your desktop users. You've got to look at your web users. You got to make something that's functional for them as well. So what I've done here is I've listed out some of the things that I think you should consider when you're looking at building yourself a GUI interface for addressing. You can see, again, pretty much the same stuff. You're going to want to be able to generate new street names, make sure they're unique, add segments, jurisdictional control. And this was something Colleen kind of touched on. When you start to deal with each one of the cities, each city may want to be able to generate their own addresses, while you want to be able to control that they can only create those addresses within their individual cities. You don't want them editing somebody else's addresses is essentially what I'm trying to get across. Some of the tools that you're going to want to look at on street segments, and we've seen this from a production standpoint, you're definitely going to want to be able to calculate ranges based off the FGDC standards. You're going to want to be able to split the streets. I'm pretty sure most all of you do this in some form or fashion. You're going to split streets at city limits. You're going to split them at counties. You're going to split them jurisdictional boundaries. So you're going to want to have tools to be able to do those things and keep your MAR up to date with that data. Same thing, those jurisdictional boundaries move, so you need to be able to merge those segments as well. Put them back together again, merge those ranges. Also, you're going to want to be able to provide those tools for aliasing. I've seen as many as 3 aliases on one particular road segment, and locals call it one thing. It might be a state highway. It might be a U.S. highway. You just don't know. So you're going to want to be able to do that. The other thing you need to do is be able to check the health. And you'll notice, again, I'm stressing that in this slide, both for the addresses and for the segment. You're going to want to verify the health of your data. And essentially the way I've done it in the past is you have a health of what GIS matches up to what's in your MAR, and what's in your MAR doesn't match up with your GIS. It's critical to keep those two in sync. Now, on an addressing standpoint, same thing. You're going to want to be able to have that jurisdictional control. You're going to want to also control the underlying spatial relationships of it. A good example is whenever a user ends up placing an address, you want to capture that place name that Colleen talked about. You're going to want to capture that zip code. You're going to want to capture anything else also. Here in Forsyth, they opted to also keep track of their fire districts on their addresses along with their segments. So you're going to want to be able to control those things. Notice I've got life cycle history. You know, an address, when it's originally placed, it's usually placed out there as potential. I've worked with counties, governments that have created every one of their potential addresses in their MAR. Don't advise it. We're talking 2.25 million potential address points versus 200,000, 300,000 that are actually going to be used. That's a parodies. That's a big one. There's got to be QA, QC checks for all of that kind of stuff. You're going to see it. There's legacy addresses out there. They were put on the wrong side. I know one address coordinator, one city, she took over and she decided that she didn't like odds on the left. She wanted evens on the left. So she went through, and for her 2 years of reign, there are quite a few subdivisions that have addresses that are not really addressed properly. When I say life cycle history, we like to see an address go through the complete life cycle, where it's a potential address, where it's been reserved, and then when it goes active. And addresses will, at some point in time, probably be retired. May not be in our lifetime, but at some point that address needs to be retired. You need to keep that history. Mail's still going to come in. Old plats are going to reference old addresses. So it is key that you keep that history. You notice we bring up landmarks. Landmarks are critical. A lot of people call in and say, oh, I'm at Greenbrier Mall. Well, you know, that's a landmark in a way. So which address? So there's multiple addresses probably to Greenbrier Mall itself. Another tool I like is having your fishbones. Fishbones allows you to look and see. It'll help you identify addresses that are out of range, help you find those anomalies. If they're missegmented, I've seen addresses associated to the wrong segment, to where when we got through running the fishbones on it, we had lines running all the way from the north end of the county all the way to segments down the southern end of the county. And it was simply naming conventions that were used and incorrect. Addresses to segment validation. That's another purpose for your fishbones. It'll help you identify those addresses that are not segmented or identified to the segment properly. And then again, address health. Let's check it. Let's make sure what we have in GIS correlates to what we have in our MAR. And again, what we have in our MAR correlates with what we have in our GIS. Okay, last part here is the part that should we or should we not? You know, a lot of people have drank the Kool-Aid. I'm going to say it. I love the model myself. If I was starting a brand new system, I'd start with that, especially if I'm not a heavy user and never been a big GIS person. I would start with the local model. It will work for you. Takes into a lot of account the relationships and stuff like that. Should handle all of that for you. But you're going to run into some problems. And I think it really, with the model, it comes down to one point. you finally get down to one point and there's that separation of you between that ESRI model into what you're going to have to do for your MAR. And that's really where it stops. ESRI will tell you point blank in their model, it's advisable for you to take a look at their feature classes, look at their attribution fields, and they advise you that you are going to probably most likely have to modify that model to fit your county specific needs. Do it. They really want you to be able to do that, and that's the whole purpose of them providing that model to you. One of the things that I find about the model that is a little shortcoming is when you get into the relationship of what Colleen had mentioned, where my fire department, they want AV for all their abbreviations. The Public Works Department, they want something else. NG 911 wants something else. And again, the views lead to all of that. And one way you can get around that with the model is forming that relationship with a relationship database. In most cases, you are going to have a separate database for your car. It cannot be a flat file. What will end up happening is you're going to end up with thousands of fields to try to satisfy all the needs of all your business partners throughout the county, whether it's water, sewer, whoever it might be. So one thing I wanted to make sure that everybody did get out of this is a screenshot here that will kind of give you an idea of what you can do. And if you'll notice in the top left-hand corner, I've got GIS streets. And I didn't do addresses because it's even deeper. But just to give you an idea, you'll notice I have GIS streets up there. I have a geometry column. And then after that, I just have a segment foreign key. That segment foreign key is just a pointer over to another table in the MAR itself. And that's where it all begins to be put together, where you're going to know what your abbreviations are, your street name, and you'll notice it kind of ties together where we get down to street types. And when you get to the street types, that's where we get into the abbreviations. Notice I've got a foreign key out of the street type ID that ties into the abbreviations itself. And the abbreviations also has another field in there that ties it all over to the abbreviation user. So whenever we deliver data or we look at delivering data to each one of these business partners, I can basically query off that user's name and I can turn around and give him exactly the view that he's going to want, the abbreviations and all of that stuff that he's going to need. Anybody got any questions on that part? It's a little convoluted, and we're going to have question and answers towards the end.
We are.
And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Diane now.
Thank you, Robert. So what I'm going to talk to you about is how we're putting all of these theories that Colleen and Robert talked about into practice. And I want to say that our project is not branded yet. We're hoping to find a good name for it soon. For right now, we're just using the sort of generic MAR to refer to this. So there are three aspects to a MAR project. There's that database structure and tools that Robert talked about. And then there's my favorite part, which is the data. And then there's the technology, and Kristen's going to talk about the technology. First, for some context, Wake County is located in the northeast central North Carolina, where the Piedmont and the coastal plains meet. The 2017 estimated population is 1,075,000 residents, which is more than the population of at least 6 states in the U.S. It's 857 square miles. We have 12 municipalities. City of Raleigh is the largest. There are 2 special districts. There's RDU Airport, and there's the Research Triangle Park, which also crosses into Durham County. We have more than 370,000 parcels of land in our county CAMA system, 62,000 street segments. There are about 22,000 street names, and a total of about 600,000 addresses. So we're talking about a lot of data. So with the two sets of data in the MAR, we have the center lines and address points. Wake County has a unified single set of center lines that we use for CAD, for GIS, for routing 911, and it's maintained solely by the county. For address points, to create our MAR, we pulled from as many sources as we could find. The county CAMA parcels was sort of like the first source we went to, but we also have lists from the Board of Elections, library patrons, water billing for Raleigh Public Utilities, as well as Cary Water. We have address points from two of the towns within our county, Fuquay-Varina and Apex. We had addresses from the AT&T database and also our in-house address points that we've collected over the past 14 years. So we worked together with the City of Raleigh to come up with a list of feature types that we needed for the address points. The main ones that are used are parcel, residential, and non-residential. And we split buildings into residential and non-residential, so we'll be able to pull the data out for doing our LUCA count for next time much more easily. So we also have feature types for utilities and other infrastructure. So, and we're reviewing the addresses, the existing addresses in sections of the county. We've automated moving points to building centroids when we could. So when there's one address and one building footprint in a parcel, then we can automate the moving at that point. If there are multiple addresses or multiple buildings, then we have to do it manually. We've also determined the type of address. We've done it automated when we could, pulling from the CAMA parcel data, but there are many of those that we've had to do manually. And it's taking months to do this. In addition to our normal workload, it's taken much longer than we had expected, actually. So, come on, data. Let me try this. Okay. Try it now. Thanks. So, and here's a section where of the county where we've added points during the planning process. And I'm going to demonstrate for you what it looks like when we do these address points. So wait a minute here. So this is our desktop tool. So up in the address manager box here, we put in the lifecycle status. We put in the feature type for the type of address and the number. And then I had hoped that this demonstration would run automatically. Can you help with that, please? Why isn't it running? Okay, thanks. So you can watch my cursor come over and I click on the center line and I add the point. And I go over and change the address over in the box here and add the next point. Here I'm over back to adding another address, another point. And then one really nice thing about this is we have some error correction built into it. So if I came over and forgot to click on the center line before putting the point in, it gives an error message. So it reminds me to click on the center line. And then if I happen to put in a wrong address, like a wrong block range, like instead of the 2300, I put the 2400 range, it also throws up an error message, and I have to fix that number. And so it's also checking if I've put in, if I'm trying to put an even number on the odd side of the street. It won't let me do that. So, okay, and there are also web tools for doing this. And let's see if this will. Okay, now we're running. Now it's working. So I'll go up and add an address. I'm putting in the life cycle status. I'm going to make it an active address. I'm going to say it's a building. I put the number in. And the system's already chosen the center line because it's the closest. And, you know, I'm going to, suppose on this parcel they're going to put an additional building. So this is what it looks like actually in use. So, so live right now, City of Raleigh's jurisdiction, they're actually using this to for their permitting system to issue addresses. Live soon in the MAR will be the Eastern Wake municipalities. Those areas are served by the Raleigh Public Utilities for water and sewer. And then in the near future will be the unincorporated part of the county as well as the southern and western Wake municipalities. Okay, and tag, you're it, Kristen.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm going to go, unfortunately, as fast as I can because we are getting to the point where we're supposed to be doing questions now from our technical difficulties. So this is what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so what's in it for us, right? So this is a partnership. This is a huge undertaking, and Wake and Raleigh have partnered together to really try to get the most out of this for all of us. So particularly for Raleigh, what's in it for us? You know, the MAR used to live at Raleigh a long time ago, and we coordinated with the county and decided that it sounded really beneficial to go ahead and move it over to the county and allow everybody to partake kind of in a county-wide MAR. So in it for us, you know, our permitting software pulls from these addresses. Now, as Diane said earlier, we have water supplies that go outside our jurisdiction into the county areas and other cities within the county. So we need addresses in those areas to be consistent with the addresses in our area so that when we're having people put permits against it, we can pull all those addresses from one place. So that's a total huge, big benefit, right? So permitting software merger community addresses. Countywide cohesiveness is a huge deal, right? So if we can get all of our addresses addressed appropriately within the county, we can make sure that we have the best data possible for things like 911. And then, of course, you know, it's a great benefit to have an extra collaboration partner along the way. Collaboration and coordination. So this was a huge effort, right? We've had weekly meetings for as long as I can remember. I started with the city 14 months ago, and I've pretty much seen these folks every week since then. We have to coordinate on tons of different things, right? So database maintenance, upgrades, updates, that stuff happens all the time. You have to keep plowing forward. If you don't, then you get behind, and we don't want that. So we've been doing Oracle upgrades, making sure that new credentials are added as necessary, upgrading different software packages, say from ArcMap 10.3 to 10.5. Things like that, worrying about network maintenance, firewall changes, security precautions, and other things like outages, right? So we coordinate on all of that, and it's kind of to the point where, you know, if we call each other, it's normal. It's almost like we work for the same entities sometimes. Okay, so we migrated from Raleigh to Wake back in July of this past year, and there was a lot that went into that. There was tons of preparation. There was testing after testing after testing to make sure that the workflow that we were using was the same methodology for Wake County and for Raleigh, so that when it came time for all of us to address in that new MAR that was the combination of Raleigh and Wake, that we would all be doing it the same way, and there wouldn't be any workflow issues of we did it one way, they did it another, now we've got a mess. So we've been coordinating for a long time. We did learn some lessons when we did a dry run, including things like don't forget to put in your credentials and make sure that all your credentials get added to whatever database you're using or setting up. Make sure that you don't forget to create any views you might need for the data, because that could be really essential. And then make sure that you have everyone's contact info. So if you have like this big go live scheduled and all of a sudden somebody disappears, that's never good. So those are some of the things we learned. But yeah, otherwise we are constantly communicating. We communicated prior to the event via emails and meetings and all sorts of things. We communicated during the event. We had 2 base stations, really. We had one over at Raleigh with about 4 or 5 people, and then they had one over at Wake County. At that point in time, we all sat in those 2 groups, and we were contacting each other by phone and email and messenger, and we kind of just went forth with the transition. Everybody had their roles, and they all walked through each step at a time as it was their turn. And ultimately, the go live was a success, and we rolled the MAR from Raleigh over to Wake County. Testing and UAT, this is a huge important thing. So every time that a new tool comes out and every time there's any kind of new technology, you have to test it. Like, don't just throw it in place and say, hey, we're going to try to upgrade on the fly and in place and not test it. That doesn't go well. Don't do it. We actually have 3 VMs set up over at Raleigh that we use for our testing. So what we'll do is we'll go upgrade those VMs to new tools, new software, whatever it may be that we're changing, and we'll test it on those. And so we actually have an addressing team of 3 people, and so each of them has a VM that they'll go on to, and they'll test their tools, make sure that everything's working, make sure that they don't get any errors, and if they do get errors, make sure that they all get the same thing so that we can debug it easier. So that has been a huge time savings, a huge pain savings, really, at the end of the day, to have those VMs. We use spreadsheets to track between Wake County and Raleigh so that we're all testing the same things. We're all testing for the same things, and we're all testing in the same order. So that has been really helpful because, like I said, when we come across errors, are we all getting the same thing? Is it all at the same point? Is it all taking the same amount of time? Those are all important things to test for. And then last but not least, connections. Connections are, for us, are like a key, right? So we live over at Raleigh, but we reach out and connect to Wake's databases every day. So if something goes wrong between Raleigh and Wake with our firewall, or just in general, one of our, like, a database goes down, or our guys get an upgrade on their computer that doesn't work, like, that connection is really the key. So we do everything that we can to doctor it and take care of those connections in between us whenever we can. And we're constantly testing to make sure that they're good to go. Okay, legal. So this is the slide that I have to, there is a legal piece of this. So if you are interested in this, which I definitely suggest partaking in joining, getting a master address repository going for you guys, there is a legal piece. You have to kind of have people looking into that. Wake and Raleigh have had a long time ago handshake where we worked together, we exchanged data. We have a really good relationship. It transitioned into an interlocal agreement back in the day, and currently we're operating under a letter of intent, and we're actually under review for a new IA, and that should be that'll be approved by both councils, and we're hoping that will get pushed through later this spring. And then challenges. So some of these guys already alluded at some things such as time. Time has been a factor, right? We weren't. You can't do this overnight. It takes a lot longer than you expect it to, and you have to be willing to put in the effort, knowing that the outcome and what you get out of it is going to be so great. So if you get out of it a completely consistent, mostly clean address repository that you can use in all your different software packages and for permitting and 911 and all these different things, and you've only done it one time, and you don't have people maintaining wrong addresses in 6 different places, it's totally worth it. But just know that it is going to take time. Cultural differences, we don't have so many cultural differences between the county and the city, but some counties and cities and some cities versus cities will have huge cultural differences. You may have a bordering city that you're trying to work with on this, and they may be way behind the times, and you may be way ahead of the times. That's something you got to keep in mind as you're working through it, and make sure that you kind of can find that level ground. And then Timeline expectations. When you're working with another entity, your timeline is not necessarily your own. Your timeline is whatever combined timeline you have. So if they have to have 911 stuff ready by April, then we need to do what we need to do in order to make sure that they can get that 911 stuff ready by April. And whatever our role is, whatever deadlines we have, we need to make sure that we hit them in time for them to hit theirs. Workflow differences. I talked about this a couple times already. Make sure you're doing things in the same way. Make sure your workflow is the same. Make sure you're clicking the same buttons in the same order, because otherwise all that effort you just put in could be out the door. And then technology complexity. Definitely, desktop versions, tool versions, Oracle clients. There's so much tool complexity that you have to keep in mind. And we've definitely run into some issues with that in the past. So have somebody that can specialize in learning these tools and understanding kind of how they work and the pieces that need to operate and be in place in order for them to work. And then overall, this has been a really rewarding relationship. We have collaborated on other things, both in the past and looking forward, and including our IMAPs and park locators that work together. And actually, I think there was a park locator talk this morning, if y'all got to see that. So it's been great to have a partner through a lot of different things at this point, and we only look forward to having that relationship maintained over time. We have the same mission, serving our community, and at the end of the day, if that's through 911 services or through getting you your address for your new house that's getting built, it's all the same community that we're serving. And we're almost there. We're hopefully in the end of the spring. This spring we'll be to the point where the WakeMar is kind of stable and ready to be fully implemented with other agencies. And then most importantly, who's in Wake County? Is anybody in here in Wake County? Okay, you should talk to us, because we should all get together on this. You guys should join us, hop on the bandwagon. Let's talk about how we can get you involved, right? This is the more the merrier, really. If we can start to work towards something seamless across different districts, it's really a great thing. Okay, that's all we have right now, and we don't have much time for questions. I think we're supposed to be done our questions, so anybody have a question? Yes?
Your stuff works in ArcMap desktop right now, or are you looking at Pro?
So the question was, does your stuff work in ArcMap desktop right now, and are you looking at Pro? Right now we are in ArcMap desktop, and we're at 10.5.1 is the version that is functional with the existing tools. I don't know, Robert, are we looking at Pro? Yes, we are looking at Pro.
The reason I asked was you talked about workflows. I know in Pro you can map out workflows where you just click through each of the steps. That way it can be easily consistent.
Yeah, that's great. So the comment was that there's a way to do workflows in Pro, and that is definitely something to consider, because I talk so much about workflows. Thank you. Anybody else have a question? Yes?
How are you handling multifamily buildings for address work? Is it one point?
Do one of you guys want to talk about that? So the question was, how are we handling addressing with multifamily buildings?
So right now we have 1 point for the building. Part of our coming soon in the time schedule is we will have the unit addresses. We'll have all of the suites for commercial. We'll have the apartment units for apartments. So the MAR will have all of those addresses. And there'll be 1 point for the building and then a point for each of those units.
Anyone else have any more questions? Okay, great. We would love to talk to you, and I'm sorry again on the time and the technology issues. So if y'all would love to talk to us, we will be right up here. And tonight you should come to the social. There is an addressing social. I believe it's in Piedmont 1. I'm not positive. It's at 5:15 tonight, so we'll be there too. And you should, especially if you raised your hand and you're in Wake County, you should come talk to us. Or we know what you look like now. Thank you.